Grace Miller learned 3 years ago that people could hear you scream in a snowstorm and still choose not to open the door. That was why she hesitated when the sound came again, sharp and deliberate beneath the howl of the blizzard. Scratch, scratch, scratch against the front of her cabin like fingernails dragging across old wood. The wind had been punishing the Montana mountains since sundown, shaking the windows hard enough to make the glass tremble in its frame, piling snow against the porch in white drifts nearly 4 feet high. Grace stood barefoot on the braided rug beside the dying fire, one hand wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold, the other already reaching for the rifle above the mantel. She hated that the first thing she reached for was a weapon. She hated more that she knew why. The last time she had trusted wolves, her own pack had dragged her into the woods for a shift trial and left her there until her lips turned blue, because a woman born to shifters who could not shift was, in Tyler Reed's words, deadweight with a pretty face. The memory hit like cold water down her spine. The circle of faces, the laughter fading as they walked away, the moon watching in silence while she begged someone, anyone, to come back. No one had. Her grandfather found her at dawn, half buried under snow, and after he died, this cabin became the only place in the world that did not ask Grace to prove she deserved warmth. Scratch, scratch, scratch. This time the sound was lower, weaker, followed by something that made her breath catch. A whine. Not wind. Not a loose shutter. Something living. Grace lifted the rifle with shaking hands and crossed the narrow room one step at a time. The floorboards creaked beneath her. The fire snapped behind her. Outside, the storm swallowed the world, turning the window into a sheet of frost and darkness. She wiped a circle clear with the sleeve of her flannel shirt and leaned close. At first she saw only snow spinning sideways. Then 2 golden eyes opened in the dark. Grace stumbled back so fast her shoulder hit the wall. A wolf stood on her porch, or tried to. It was enormous, far larger than any mountain wolf had a right to be. Its white silver fur crusted with ice, its body swaying like the storm itself was holding it upright. Dark stains marked the snow beneath one foreleg. But what froze Grace in place was not its size, or the blood, or the impossible intelligence burning in its eyes. It was the way the wolf lowered its head when it saw her rifle, not in surrender, not exactly, but as if it understood fear and was asking not to be punished for needing help. Grace's throat tightened. Wild predators were not pets. Wolves were not safe. Shifters were worse. Every lesson life had carved into her bones told her to back away, lock the door, let the storm decide. But then the wolf's front legs buckled. It hit the porch hard enough to shake snow from the railing, and the sound that left it was too soft, too tired, almost human in its pain. Grace closed her eyes. She saw herself at 22, shaking beneath pine branches, waiting for footsteps that never returned. She saw Tyler's smile. She heard the word useless. When she opened her eyes, the wolf was still watching her through the frost, and somehow its gaze felt less like a threat than a question. What kind of person are you when no one is watching? Grace set the rifle against the wall, though her hand did not want to let go. Her heartbeat hammered so loudly she could barely hear the storm. She crossed to the door and slid the deadbolt free. The click sounded like a gunshot in the little cabin. Cold rushed in before she even pulled the door open, brutal and sharp, stealing the breath from her lungs. Snow swept across the floor. The wolf collapsed forward, too heavy, too cold, too real, and Grace caught what she could of him with both arms as his frozen fur pressed against her chest. He should have crushed her. He should have terrified her. Instead, his head fell against her shoulder, and beneath the ice and blood and storm, Grace heard one faint, impossible sound, not a growl, not a whine, but something like her name. The wolf was heavier than anything Grace had ever tried to move, all ice-stiff fur and trembling muscle. But fear lent her strength that kindness alone might not have found. She hooked both arms under his chest, braced her heels against the porch boards, and pulled until the storm gave him up inch by inch. Snow swept over her bare feet. Cold bit through her flannel pajama pants. The wolf made no attempt to resist, and that frightened her more than if he had snapped at her. Wolves fought. Wolves ran. Wolves did not let lonely women drag them across cabin floors like fallen kings. By the time she got him inside, her lungs burned and her hands shook so hard she could barely force the door shut. The deadbolt slid home with a dull thud, sealing them both inside with the firelight, the wind, and the terrible choice she had just made. Grace stood over him for one breath. Two, the rifle still within reach, her pulse racing as the huge animal lay on her mother's braided rug and watched her through half-lidded golden eyes. Do not be stupid, she told herself. Do not forget what teeth can do. But the wolf's breathing came shallow and uneven. Each exhale a faint white mist in the cold air that had followed him inside, and the dark stain near his foreleg had spread onto the rug. Grace swallowed the knot in her throat. You do not get to die on my floor, she whispered, though her voice cracked around the words. I opened the door. That means you have to survive. His ear twitched, almost as if he understood. That small movement broke something in her. She dropped to her knees beside him and reached for the old quilt folded near the hearth, the last thing her mother had sewn before fever took her. The quilt still smelled faintly of cedar from the Hope chest, and Grace hesitated for one painful second before spreading it over the wolf's frozen back. Her mother had believed warmth was never wasted. Grace tried to believe that too. She fed 2 more logs into the stove, then filled the kettle and set it near the flame. Her medical supplies were not much: clean towels, sewing thread, rubbing alcohol, dried yarrow, willow bark, and a small glass jar of moonroot salve her grandfather had taught her to make. Pack healers had laughed at those remedies, called them human tricks, kitchen magic, desperate little cures for a girl with no wolf. Yet those kitchen cures were all she had, and tonight they would have to be enough. She worked carefully, speaking in a low voice because silence felt too much like waiting for bad news. I'm going to clean this. You are going to hate it. Please remember I am smaller than you, and trying very hard not to regret my choices. The wolf's eyes opened a fraction wider. Grace almost laughed, a quick breathless sound that vanished when she parted the fur around the wound and saw the strange gray shimmer at its edge. Not ordinary injury. Not a hunter's accident. Silver. Her stomach sank. Silver was used against shifters, not wild animals. Her fingers hovered, cold suddenly for a reason that had nothing to do with the storm. What are you? She whispered. The wolf did not answer, but his gaze sharpened, and for a heartbeat Grace felt as if there was a man trapped behind those eyes, listening from somewhere far away. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, expecting a growl, expecting teeth, expecting the punishment life had trained her to anticipate whenever she got too close to something powerful. None came. The wolf only pressed his head against the rug, claws flexing once, then stilling when she laid a hand on his neck. His fur was freezing beneath her palm, but under it his pulse beat strong, stubborn, royal in a way she could not explain. Grace mixed warm water with crushed yarrow and a sliver of moonroot, then worked the salve around the silver-burned edges. The scent rose at once, sharp and clean, like mint under moonlight. The wolf shuddered. A low sound rolled through his chest, not threatening, not tame, something between pain and relief. Easy, Grace murmured. I know it hurts. The words slipped out before she could stop them, the same words no one had said to her when she was the one shaking in the snow. Her throat tightened. She blinked hard and focused on tying the bandage, because crying over a wolf she had known for less than an hour would be foolish, and Grace Miller had survived too much to be foolish. When the bandage was secure, she sat back on her heels, exhausted, damp hair sticking to her cheek, hands stained with herbs and melted snow. The wolf's breathing had steadied. The fire painted gold along his white fur, and as the ice began to thaw, Grace noticed something half hidden beneath the thick ruff at his neck. Not a collar exactly. A strip of dark leather, torn and nearly frozen into the fur. She should have left it alone. She knew she should have. Instead, she leaned closer and worked it free with careful fingers. A small metal emblem hung from the leather, blackened as if someone had tried to burn it. Grace rubbed it with her thumb until the soot came away. A crown appeared beneath it, carved above the silhouette of a wolf. Her breath stopped. Every child in the Northern Territories knew that symbol. It belonged to the royal house of Blackwood. It belonged to the Alpha King. The kettle began to whistle, shrill and sudden, and Grace flinched so hard the emblem slipped from her hand. The wolf's eyes opened, gold fixed on her. For one impossible second, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then, from deep in the wolf's throat, broken by fever and storm and something that sounded far too much like a human voice, came a single faint sound. Grace. Grace did not move for several seconds after the sound left the wolf's throat. The kettle screamed on the stove, the storm clawed at the roof, and the blackened royal emblem lay between them on the floor like proof of something Grace was not ready to believe. She told herself fever could make any sound seem like a word. She told herself wind could slip through old walls and shape itself into whatever a lonely woman feared most. She told herself a wolf could not know her name. Yet the way those golden eyes held hers made every sensible thought feel thin and useless. Grace forced herself to stand, cross to the stove, and move the kettle off the heat before the noise split her nerves in half. "You did not say that," she whispered, turning back slowly. "I am tired, and you are hurt, and this cabin is making both of us strange." The wolf blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if disagreeing politely. That annoyed her more than it should have. "Fine," she said, because speaking was easier than panicking. "Since you are apparently too mysterious to be a normal wolf, I am going to call you Silver. Do not look offended. It is either that or Snowdrift, and you do not seem like the kind of wolf who would forgive Snowdrift." His ear twitched. Grace stared at him. That was almost a joke. The fire popped, throwing sparks against the stove glass. For the first time since she had dragged him inside, the wolf lowered his head fully onto the quilt, but he did not close his eyes. He watched her as she cleaned the melted snow from the floor, as she hung her wet flannel shirt near the stove, as she wrapped herself in an old gray cardigan and tried not to glance at the royal crest every 3 breaths. Outside, the blizzard deepened. By midnight, the windows had vanished behind thick frost, and the radio gave only static when Grace turned the dial. The road down the mountain would be buried until the county plows came through, and they rarely came this far unless someone called. No one would call for Grace Miller. Not anymore. She made broth from a jar of chicken stock and a handful of dried herbs, then set a bowl near Silver's muzzle. He sniffed it, looked at her, and pushed it back with his nose. Grace frowned. "You need it more than I do." Silver pushed it again, this time until it bumped her knee. The gesture was so plainly stubborn, so strangely gentlemanlike, that her chest tightened before she could stop it. "You are ridiculous," she murmured, but she drank half the broth before setting the rest down again. Only then did he lap from the bowl, slow and careful, never taking his eyes entirely off the door. That was the first thing she noticed as the hours stretched on. Silver did not behave like an animal resting in safety. He listened. Every groan of timber made his muscles tense. Every blast of wind made his ears angle toward the porch. Once, when a branch scraped the east window, he pushed himself up despite the bandage and placed his body between Grace and the sound before she could even reach for the rifle. "Hey," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "It is just a tree." Silver did not relax until she laid one hand against his shoulder. Warmth pulsed under her palm now, stronger than before, and some answering warmth moved beneath her skin, faint as moonlight under water. Grace pulled her hand back quickly. "That is new," she breathed. Silver watched her wrist. She looked down and saw nothing. Only the pale skin and the small scar left from her old shift trial. But the skin tingled as though something sleeping beneath it had opened one eye. To distract herself, she spoke. At first it was only practical nonsense about the storm, the stove, the road, and how much firewood they had left. Then the words became heavier. Maybe because Silver could not repeat them. Maybe because his silence did not feel empty. "Tyler said I was lucky he rejected me quietly," she said, her voice low enough that the storm almost swallowed it. "He said another man would have done it in front of the whole pack. Like I should be grateful for being thrown away in private." Silver's lips lifted from his teeth, not at her, never at her, but toward the dark window. Grace gave a small, humorless laugh. "You understand that, do you? Being looked at like you are less than what everyone expected." The wolf's gaze returned to her, and something in it was so fierce, so focused, that her throat went tight. She had expected pity to hurt. She had not expected being understood to hurt more. The room blurred. Grace wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand and looked away. "I did not cry then," she said. "Not when Tyler walked off. Not when the others followed him. Not even when I realized they had taken the lantern. I waited until morning because I thought if I cried, the cold would get inside faster." Silver made a soft sound, barely more than breath, and shifted close enough that his fur brushed her knee. He did not crowd her. He did not demand. He simply stayed. Grace had no defense against that. She rested her hand lightly between his ears, and for a few quiet minutes, the cabin held only firelight, snow, and the fragile peace of two wounded creatures sharing warmth. Then Silver went utterly still. His head lifted, his eyes fixed on the window behind her. Grace's skin prickled before she heard anything. Not the wind, not a branch. A soft crunch in the snow, measured and careful, moving against the storm rather than with it. She reached for the rifle, but before her fingers touched the stock, a voice entered her mind, deep, strained, and unmistakably human. Do not trust the men in black. Grace froze with her hand inches from the rifle, the voice still echoing through her skull as if it had been spoken inside her bones. Do not trust the men in black. Silver had not moved his mouth. He could barely stand. Yet the warning carried the weight of command, old and royal and exhausted, and every instinct Grace had spent years trying to bury rose to attention. Outside, the careful footsteps stopped just beyond the porch. The storm should have hidden them. No ordinary person would have crossed 6 miles of mountain road in a blizzard unless they were desperate, dangerous, or both. Grace forced air into her lungs, lifted the rifle, and stepped toward the door while Silver struggled to rise behind her. Stay down, she whispered, not looking back. A low sound rumbled from him, weak but unmistakably offended. Before she could answer, 3 hard knocks struck the door. Not a neighbor's knock, not a plea for shelter, a knock that expected obedience. Grace swallowed, slid the safety on, and kept the rifle angled toward the floor as she called, "Who is it?" A man's voice answered through the wood, smooth as polished stone. "Royal Hunters, by order of Lord Regent Marcus Vane. Open the door, Miss Miller." Her stomach tightened at her name. No one from the crown should know she existed. She glanced at Silver. His golden eyes had gone flat and cold, fixed on the door with a hatred so controlled it frightened her more than a growl would have. Grace crossed the room, pulled the quilt higher over his body, and shoved the blackened royal emblem beneath the edge of the rug with her foot. Then she opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. Snow blew in sideways, sharp as thrown sand. 3 men stood on her porch in long black winter coats, their faces half hidden by scarves, their boots clean in a way that made no sense after a climb through the mountain. The tallest one smiled without warmth. "Evening, ma'am. Sorry to disturb you in this weather." His eyes moved past her shoulder, searching the cabin before returning to her face. "We are tracking a dangerous animal." Grace kept her expression blank, the way she had learned to do when pack women whispered wolfless behind her back. "A lot of dangerous animals live in these woods. Not like this one," the hunter said. "A white wolf. Unusually large. Possibly infected. Possibly connected to the attack on the royal convoy 3 nights ago." Grace's fingers tightened around the doorframe. 3 nights ago, the first rumors had reached the general store in town. The Alpha King's caravan had been ambushed beyond Black Pine Pass. Caleb Blackwood was missing, maybe dead. Marcus Vane, his cousin, had taken emergency control of the court until the truth could be confirmed. Grace had heard the story while buying oats and lamp oil, and she had thought what everyone else thought. Royal trouble belonged to royal people. It did not come bleeding onto your porch. "I have not seen any convoy," she said. The hunter's gaze sharpened at the careful answer. "That was not my question." Wind pushed snow through the crack in the door, melting against her bare ankle. Grace did not move. Behind the men, lantern light flashed against leather gloves, and she saw the mark stamped near the wrist of the tallest hunter. Not the royal crown. A black thorn wrapped around a crescent blade. The Vane family crest. Her pulse stumbled. If they served the crown, they would wear Blackwood. They wore Marcus. Silver's warning pressed through her mind again. Colder now. Not words this time, but urgency. "I heard something earlier," Grace admitted, choosing each word as if stepping across thin ice. "Could have been a wolf. Could have been the wind. Everything sounds alive out here tonight." The second hunter leaned slightly, trying to see around her. "May we come in and warm ourselves while we ask a few questions?" It sounded polite. It was not. Grace thought of the night Tyler's father had said they only wanted to test her strength. Nothing cruel, nothing she could not handle. She thought of how many terrible things began with men asking permission they did not intend to need. For the first time in years, she let herself be rude. "No," the word came out small, but it held. "The hunters." Smile faded. "Miss Miller, Refusing royal assistance during an active search is unwise. So is hiking into a storm to question a woman alone in her home, Grace said, her voice steadier now. If you are truly royal hunters, you can leave a notice at the county station when the road clears. The third man shifted, and something silver glinted beneath his coat. Grace did not look at it directly. She looked at the tallest hunter's eyes and made herself appear more tired than afraid. After a long moment, he stepped back. Of course. Stay inside tonight. Lock your doors. If you see the wolf, do not approach it. Creatures like that make people think they can be saved. His gaze dropped briefly to the wet floorboards near her feet, where melted snow formed a trail from the door to the hearth. Usually, they cannot. Grace closed the door before her hands could start shaking. She waited until their footsteps retreated into the storm, waited until even Silver's ears lowered a fraction, and then she slid to the floor with her back against the wood. Her whole body trembled, but not from cold. Marcus Vane is not hunting an infected wolf, she whispered. He is hunting you. Silver pushed himself upright with visible effort and crossed the few feet between them. He lowered his head and placed something small and pale in her open palm. A broken wolf tooth, smooth at the root, sharp at the edge, marked with a thin line of gold that shimmered faintly in the firelight. Grace stared at it, her breath caught between fear and wonder. Silver nudged her hand closed around it, then pressed his forehead to her knuckles like a vow. Grace did not sleep after the hunters left. She sat beside the stove with the broken wolf tooth wrapped in both hands, listening to the storm drag its claws across the cabin roof, while Silver lay between her and the door like a white shadow carved from moonlight. Every time the wind shifted, his ears lifted. Every time the old walls settled, his eyes opened. He was weaker than he wanted her to know, but Grace had spent her life studying the difference between strength and pretending. By 2 a.m, his breathing had grown uneven again, and the bandage at his foreleg had darkened where the silver burn refused to close. Grace knelt beside him with fresh water and moonroot salve, trying to ignore the strange pull in her wrist that came whenever she touched him. It was not pain. It was not fear. It was more like standing outside before a snowfall, feeling the air change before the first flake fell. You are going to have to let me clean it again, she said softly. And before you look offended, no, glaring at me does not count as medical cooperation. Silver gave the faintest huff through his nose. Grace almost smiled, then lost it when her fingers brushed the wound and a pale thread of light moved under her skin. She froze. The small scar on her wrist, the one left from the shift trial rope, glowed beneath the surface like moonlight trapped in a vein. Silver saw it too. His whole body went still, and for the first time since she had opened the door, he looked afraid. Not of her. For her. What is happening to me? Grace whispered. The cabin answered with a sudden gust that rattled every window at once. Silver tried to rise, but his legs failed him. Grace caught his shoulder, and the moment her palm pressed to his fur, the light in her wrist spread in a thin silver-blue line across her hand. The salve warmed. The air filled with the scent of pine, snow, and something ancient, clean, and wild. Silver's golden eyes locked on hers. In them, Grace saw warning, apology, and a command he did not have the strength to give. Then the room tilted. The fire roared too bright. The shadows bent toward the hearth. Silver's body shuddered beneath her hand, not violently, but like a frozen river cracking open under spring sun. Grace stumbled back, hard in her throat, as light gathered around him in a soundless wave. She grabbed the quilt and turned her face away, more from instinct than fear. When the light faded, the cabin went impossibly quiet. No claws scratched the floor. No heavy wolf breath stirred the rug. Grace lowered the quilt slowly. A man lay where the wolf had been, one arm braced against the floor, his dark blonde hair damp with melted snow, his shoulders wrapped in her mother's quilt, his skin pale from exhaustion, his eyes the same impossible gold. Grace forgot how to breathe. He looked human, but nothing about him felt ordinary. Power clung to him, even wounded, even kneeling, even wrapped in old patchwork beside a dented stove. It filled the room the way thunder filled the sky before rain, silent until it decided not to be. Grace's hand shot toward the rifle. He saw the movement and did not try to stop her. That stopped her more effectively than a command would have. The man lowered his head, slowly, carefully, showing empty hands. I will not hurt you, he said. His voice was rough, strained, and unmistakably the same voice that had warned her in her mind. Grace gripped the rifle but did not lift it. Who are you? He paused for half a second too long. Caleb. Her chest tightened around the name. She waited for the rest of it, for Blackwood, for King, for the truth sitting between them like the hidden emblem beneath the rug. He did not give it. Just Caleb, she asked. Something flickered across his face, grief or caution, gone before she could name it. For tonight, yes. Grace should have been angry. Part of her was. But the larger part was watching the way he kept himself still, the way he did not use the size of his body or the weight of his gaze to trap her. In her own cabin, with her rifle in reach and his secret exposed, he waited for her decision. No alpha in her old pack had ever done that. You can sit by the fire, she said at last, her voice unsteady. You can answer questions when you are strong enough. You cannot lie to me in my own house. Caleb's expression softened by a degree so small most people would have missed it. Grace did not. Fair, he said. He tried to shift his weight and failed, jaw tightening as pain pulled the color from his face. Grace moved before she thought, catching his shoulder through the quilt. The contact sent another quiet flare through her wrist. Caleb looked down at it, and every trace of softness vanished into shock. He reached toward her hand, then stopped himself before touching her. The restraint hit harder than touch would have. May I see? He asked. Grace stared at him. May I? Not give it to me. Not hold still. Not obey. Slowly, she held out her wrist. He leaned closer, careful to keep space between them, and studied the glowing scar as though it was a prayer he had not expected to survive. His voice dropped to a whisper. They told me your bloodline was extinct. Grace's mouth went dry. What bloodline? Caleb lifted his eyes to hers, and in the firelight, he looked less like a wounded stranger and more like a man who had crossed death to find the one person he was never supposed to endanger. Before he could answer, a distant howl rose beyond the storm, low and searching, and Caleb's face hardened. Marcus has found the mountain road. Caleb moved before Grace could ask another question, pulling the quilt tighter around himself as he forced his body upright with the stubbornness of a man who had survived because surrender had never learned his name. The distant howl rolled through the storm again, lower this time, answered by another from the ridge beyond the cabin. Grace felt the sound in the floorboards, in the windows, in the small bones of her wrist where the silver blue light still shimmered beneath her skin. You need to leave, Caleb said. His voice was calm, which made it worse. There is a root cellar beneath the back room. Bolt it from the inside. Whatever you hear, whatever anyone says, you do not open it. Grace stared at him. You are barely standing. I have been barely standing for 3 days. That does not make this plan better. His mouth tightened, almost like he wanted to smile and had forgotten how. Grace. Her name in his voice was not a command. It was a plea disguised as control, and that frightened her more than the howls. Before she could answer, headlights flashed through the frosted window, pale and sweeping, cutting across the cabin wall like searchlights. No county plow could climb the mountain road in that storm. No neighbor had reason to come. Grace crossed to the side window and looked through the thin, clear space she had wiped earlier. Several black trucks stood at the tree line, engines low, snow curling around their tires. Men in dark coats moved between the pines with lanterns shaded red against the weather. At the front of them stood Tyler Reed. For one awful second, the cabin vanished and Grace was back in the clearing 3 years ago, watching him turn away while she shivered beneath the moon. He looked older now, broader, wrapped in a black coat with the vane crest pinned near his collar as if loyalty were something he could wear and remove when it suited him. He lifted his head toward the cabin, and even through the storm, Grace knew he had found her. He told them, she whispered. Caleb came to stand behind her, one hand braced against the wall, but not touching her, careful even now. Who is he? Grace's throat went tight. The man who decided I was not worth coming back for. Caleb's gaze shifted to Tyler, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Then he has made a second mistake. A voice boomed from outside, carried through some kind of speaker. Grace Miller, come out of the cabin with your hands visible. You are sheltering a royal fugitive infected with unstable magic. Cooperate, and Lord Regent Vane will show mercy. Grace laughed once, sharp and humorless. Mercy had always been the favorite word of people who had already decided you were guilty. Caleb turned toward the back room. Cellar. Now. No. He looked at her then, fully, and the force of him nearly stole her breath. He was wounded, exhausted, half hidden under her mother's quilt, and still every inch of him felt like a storm holding itself back for her sake. Grace, if Marcus has Tyler, then he has your history. He will use it. He already did. She picked up the broken wolf tooth from the table and closed her fingers around it. He used it when he left me in the snow. He does not get to use it again while I hide under my own floor. The front door rattled under another knock, this one not polite. Grace opened it before Caleb could stop her, stepping onto the porch in her boots and cardigan, rifle left behind by the stove because she would not give Marcus the excuse he wanted. The cold seized her at once, but she kept her chin lifted. Tyler stood at the bottom of the steps with 2 hunters behind him and Marcus Vane beside him, elegant in a black overcoat, his dark hair untouched by the snow as if even weather had been instructed to respect him. Marcus looked nothing like a monster. That was the dangerous thing. He looked like a gentleman arriving for dinner. Miss Miller, Marcus said warmly. I was told you had a habit of taking in broken things. Grace said nothing. Tyler's eyes flicked over her face, then toward the door behind her. You always did want something powerful to notice you, he said. The words landed exactly where he aimed them, old shame waking like a bruise. Still pretending kindness makes you special? Grace's fingers tightened around the wolf tooth until the gold line warmed against her palm. Still pretending cruelty makes you strong? Tyler's expression hardened, but Marcus lifted one hand, silencing him with casual ease. Enough. The creature inside your cabin belongs to the crown. Step aside. If he belongs to the crown, why are you wearing your own crest instead of his? For the first time, Marcus's smile thinned. The red lanterns shifted. Men began moving around the cabin, closing the distance. Grace realized then that Marcus had never expected her to obey. He had only needed her outside. From the tree line came the soft metallic whisper of silver snares being drawn through the snow, forming a wide circle around the porch and the cabin door. Caleb's voice sounded behind her, low and furious. Grace. She turned just as he stepped into the doorway, no longer fully human, no longer only wolf, power gathering around him like moonlight before a storm. I told you to hide, he said. And I told you no. Marcus's eyes lit with triumph. There he is. A silver snare snapped tight across the porch rail, not touching Grace, but closing off the steps. Caleb moved in front of her so fast the air changed, placing his body between her and every hunter without once pushing her back. The silver circle brightened in the snow, weakening him with each pulse, yet he stayed upright. Tyler stared at him, recognition dawning too late. One by one, from far beyond the black trucks and the red lanterns, the forest answered with howls. Not Marcus's hunters, not Tyler's pack. Dozens of voices rose from the mountain, wild and loyal, calling to a king they had been told was dead. The howls changed everything. The hunters who had stepped forward with such confidence stopped in the snow, their red lanterns swaying in gloved hands. Their attention dragged toward the dark trees where voices answered one another across the mountain. Not random wolves. Not storm noise. A gathering call. Marcus Vane heard it too, and for the first time since Grace had opened the door, his polished calm cracked at the edges. Caleb stood before her on the porch, shoulders squared against the pull of the silver circle, his golden eyes fixed on Marcus with a stillness that made every man below them seem smaller. The air around him shimmered faintly, not with heat, but with power forcing its way through weakness. Grace saw the effort cost him. She saw his hand tighten against the porch post, saw the brief tremor in his jaw, saw how the silver laid through the snow drained color from his face. He was standing because she was behind him. That realization struck her harder than fear. Kneel, Caleb said. The word was quiet. It should not have carried through the storm. It did. 2 hunters dropped to one knee before they seemed to understand why. One covered his own mouth, eyes wide with terror and awe. Tyler went pale. Marcus lifted his chin. A convincing trick, he said, but his voice had lost its warmth. A desperate animal wearing a king's face. Caleb took one step down from the porch. The silver circle flashed beneath the snow, and Grace felt the shock of it ripple through her wrist as if the mark under her skin had been tied to him. She moved instinctively, reaching for him, but Caleb raised one hand without looking back. not to command her to stay away, to spare her the sting. Then the light around him broke outward like moonlight through cloud. For one breath, the man and the wolf seemed to occupy the same space. The wounded stranger from her hearth, the white silver wolf from her porch, and something older than both, crowned not by metal but by recognition. The blackened emblem beneath Grace's rug suddenly warmed inside the cabin, and every royal guard hidden among Marcus's men felt it. One by one their eyes dropped. Alpha King Caleb Blackwood, whispered the tallest hunter from the night before. The name passed through the group like a match touching dry paper. Blackwood, king, alive. Marcus's expression went empty, then careful. He had not planned to reveal Caleb in front of men whose loyalty had only been borrowed. He had expected an animal, a fugitive, a body in the snow, not a king with witnesses. So he did what clever cowards always did when truth became dangerous. He turned the blame toward the woman no one had been taught to protect. Look at him, Marcus called, spreading his hands. Weak, confused, poisoned by mountain witchcraft, led from his own convoy by a wolfless outcast who just happened to know how to keep him hidden. Grace felt the words hit the circle around them and spread. Witch, outcast, wolfless, old labels dressed in new fear. Tyler found his courage when the accusation gave him somewhere to stand. She has always wanted power, he said loudly, though he would not meet Grace's eyes. She used to stare at alpha families like she could steal what she was not born with. When I rejected her, she became desperate. Grace's face went hot despite the cold. For a moment she was back in the old pack hall, standing still while people judged what they had never bothered to understand. Caleb turned his head slightly, and his voice lowered into something more dangerous than anger. Say another word against her, and you will answer it before the crown. Marcus smiled then, because Caleb had given him the opening he needed. Exactly. The crown must decide. He looked to the uncertain guards, to the hunters, to Tyler, to the distant wolves gathering beyond the trees. If he is truly our king, he deserves a public hearing at court. If she is innocent, she has nothing to fear from royal law. Grace almost laughed. People who said that never understood how often law had been built by the same hands that held the keys. By dawn, the storm had thinned to a gray snowfall, and Grace was taken down the mountain in the back of a black truck with Caleb seated across from her under guard, not because the guards dared command him, but because he was too weakened by silver poison to stand for long. His eyes never left her. When the truck jolted over frozen ruts, he braced one hand against the bench but did not reach for her without permission. Even now, even bound by politics and poison and lies, he gave her that choice. The royal court rose from the valley like a white stone fortress cut into the mountainside, all towers, iron gates, and banners snapping beneath a pale winter sun. Grace had seen photographs of Blackwood Court in newspapers, but no photograph could capture how small it made a person feel to walk through its doors in borrowed boots with mud on her hem and whispers gathering like crows. Nobles filled the hall by the time Marcus presented her before the silver dais. Tyler stood to one side, clean coat buttoned, expression rehearsed. Caleb stood at the foot of the throne steps, pale but upright, fury banked behind his eyes as royal physicians hovered uselessly nearby. Marcus addressed the court as if he were already king. Grace Miller claimed she saved him. I say she bound him. I say her blood carries forbidden magic that twisted loyalty into obsession and weakness into trust. Murmurs swept the hall. Grace held Caleb's gaze and found, to her surprise, that her hands were not shaking. Marcus lifted a glass lantern from a velvet tray. Inside it burned a pale silver flame, cold and bright as a star without mercy. Let the court witness the truth, he said. If she is harmless, the flame will show it. If she is what I believe she is, every soul in this room will know. The guards brought the lantern toward Grace, and the mark on her wrist began to glow. The silver flame came closer, carried in a glass lantern by a guard whose hands trembled despite the weight of his uniform. Grace watched the cold light spill across the marble floor, watched it climb the hem of her borrowed coat, watched every noble in Blackwood Court lean forward as if her shame were a show prepared for their entertainment. Her mouth went dry, but she did not step back. She had spent too many years backing away from rooms where people had already decided what she was. Wolfless, useless, desperate, unwanted. The words circled her like winter. Birds, sharp beaks and colder eyes. But beneath them, the mark on her wrist pulsed with a slow silver-blue glow that did not feel like fear. It felt like recognition. Caleb shifted at the foot of the throne steps, and 3 guards moved at once as if to block him. He did not look at them. He looked only at Grace. "You do not have to prove anything to them," he said. His voice was quiet, but it moved through the court with more force than Marcus's speeches ever had. Grace held his gaze, and the room narrowed until there was only the man who had been a wolf at her door, the man who had asked permission before touching her hand, the man who had stood between her and every accusation, even when silver poison made standing painful. "I know," she said. Then she turned toward the flame. "But they need to see it." Marcus's smile returned, thin and satisfied, because he mistook courage for surrender. "Proceed." The guard lifted the lantern. Cold light washed over Grace's wrist. For one breath, nothing happened. Then the silver flame bent toward her, not like fire finding fuel, but like a lost thing finding home. Gasps broke across the court. The flame turned blue, then white, then a deep moonlit shade that painted the walls with moving patterns of branches, snow, and wolves running beneath stars. Grace felt warmth rise through her hand, not burning, not hurting, only opening. The old scar from the shift trial brightened, and from it spread delicate lines of light, circling her wrist like a bracelet woven from moonbeams. The court fell silent. Even Marcus stopped breathing. An elderly woman near the front, draped in the dark green robes of the royal healers, covered her mouth with both hands. "Moon healer," she whispered. The words moved from her lips to the hall, from the hall to every shocked face. That bloodline was lost. Grace looked down at her glowing wrist, and a strange calm settled over her. All her life, people had looked at the absence of a wolf and called it emptiness. No one had ever thought to ask whether something else had been sleeping there instead. The royal healer stepped forward, tears shining in her eyes. "Silver flame does not obey witches. It reveals origin. Her blood is not a curse. It is sanctuary." Caleb's eyes closed for one brief moment, not in weakness, but relief so deep it looked almost painful. Marcus recovered first. "Sentiment," he snapped. "The court will not be swayed by pretty light." "No," Grace said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. She lifted her wrist higher. The flame followed her, bending like a loyal animal. "But it might be swayed by poison." She turned to the royal healer. "The silver in his blood is not ordinary. It was mixed with wolfsbane and blackthorn ash. Someone wanted him alive long enough to look unstable, weak enough to be controlled, and missing long enough for a regent to take his seat." The healer's face hardened with professional understanding. "That combination is restricted to Crown Laboratories." The murmurs returned, different now, sharper, directed not at Grace, but at Marcus. Caleb walked toward her then. No one stopped him. Each step cost him, but the court parted as if the memory of his crown had finally woken in their bones. He reached Grace and held out his hand, palm up, asking again without words. She placed her glowing wrist in his care. The silver-blue light flowed from her skin into his, tracing faint lines beneath his veins. Color returned to his face. The tension in his shoulders eased. The court watched the impossible become undeniable. Marcus's accusation had not exposed Grace as dangerous. It had exposed her as the reason their king was still alive. Caleb turned, still holding her hand gently enough that she could have pulled away at any time. "Marcus Vane," he said, and the throne room seemed to lower its head around him. "You used royal poison against your king, wore another house's crest over crown duty, and accused the woman who saved my life to hide your treason." Marcus took one step back. Tyler looked suddenly young, suddenly small, as if the polished floor beneath him had become thin ice. Caleb's gaze moved to him. "Tyler Reed, you gave false witness before the court and dressed old cruelty as truth." Tyler opened his mouth, but no sound came. Grace expected triumph to feel warmer. Instead, it felt clean, like the first breath after leaving a room full of smoke. Caleb faced the court. "Grace Miller is not a witch, not an outcast, and not a desperate woman reaching for power. She is the savior of the crown, the last moon healer of the northern bloodline, and the only reason I stand before you." One by one, nobles lowered their heads. The healer knelt first, then the guards. Then the court that had whispered over Grace's muddy boots bowed before the woman they had expected to condemn. Caleb released her hand, stepped back, and lowered himself to one knee in front of everyone. Grace's breath caught. He did not reach for her. He did not claim her before she could choose. He only looked up at her with golden eyes that had once watched her through frost-covered glass and asked, "Grace Miller, will you stand beside me because you want to, not because anyone says you must?" Grace looked down at Caleb Blackwood kneeling before her, and for a moment the whole court disappeared. Not because she forgot them, but because she finally understood that being seen by everyone did not matter as much as being free in front of them. The old Grace, the girl left in the snow, the woman who had learned to make herself small so others would not notice what she lacked, might have reached for his hand at once simply because a king had offered it. But the woman standing there now knew the difference between being rescued and being chosen, and she knew the difference between being claimed and being owned. Her wrists still glowed with moonlit fire. Around her, nobles knelt, guards bowed, and Tyler Reed stared at the floor as if shame had finally become too heavy to hold upright. Marcus Vane stood rigid between two royal guards, his polished face drained of every lie he had worn so well. Grace should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt quiet, clean, like snow after a storm had stopped. She looked at Caleb and said, "I cannot answer you here." A ripple moved through the court, but Caleb only nodded once, as if he had expected nothing less from her than honesty. He rose slowly, not offended, not wounded, not angry. "Then I will wait," he said. Those 4 words settled over Grace more gently than any crown could have. By sunset, Marcus had been removed from power to face royal judgment before the council he had deceived, and Tyler's false testimony had been stripped from the record in front of every pack leader present. The royal healer confirmed the poison, the stolen laboratory seal, and the truth Grace had spoken. No one called her wolfless after that. They called her moon healer in whispers at first, then aloud, then with bowed heads. Yet when servants offered Grace silk gowns and warm chambers in the palace, her chest tightened the way it had in the cabin when the hunters knocked. Too many walls, too many eyes, too many people suddenly eager to honor what they had been ready to condemn. So she asked for one thing, to go home. Caleb did not argue. He ordered no escort to crowd her, made no speech about duty, and did not use the word Luna as if it were a chain made of gold. He simply rode with her through the mountain road after the plows had carved a narrow path between the drifts, his black coat dusted with snow, his eyes on the dark pines where the first howls had answered him. When they reached the cabin, twilight had turned the windows blue. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. Snow covered the porch steps, soft and untouched except for the faint marks left from that night, already filling in, already becoming memory. Grace stood at the door with the key in her hand and felt the ache of everything that had happened inside those small wooden walls. Fear, mercy, secrets, fever, firelight, and a wolf who had become a king without ever forgetting how gently she had touched his wounds. Caleb stopped at the bottom of the steps. He did not follow her to the door. Grace turned back. "You can come in," she said. His gaze held hers. "Only if you are sure." The words reached the deepest bruised place in her, the place that had never been asked before, only taken from, judged, or left behind. Grace opened the door and smiled through the sting in her eyes. "I am sure." He stepped inside after her, and this time there was no blood on the floor, no rifle between them, no storm forcing a choice. Grace lit the stove while Caleb hung his coat beside hers. The cabin filled slowly with warmth. Outside, wolves gathered at the edge of the trees, not threatening, not demanding, only waiting beneath the rising moon. Grace walked to the window and saw members of her old pack among them, heads lowered in silent apology. Tyler knelt apart from the others, stripped of his rank, unable to meet her eyes. Once, that sight would have been the ending she wanted. Now it was only part of it. The real ending stood beside her, close enough for warmth, far enough for choice. Caleb held out the broken wolf tooth he had given her, now threaded on a thin silver chain and cleaned until the gold line shone. "This was a vow before I had words," he said. "Let it be one again. Not a claim that takes your freedom. A promise that wherever you stand, cabin or court, snow or throne, you will never stand alone." Grace touched the tooth, then his hand. The mark on her wrist answered, silver blue and steady. Then I choose you, she said. Caleb bowed